Imagine a world where people trusted ale more than water. In the bustling towns and quiet villages of medieval Europe, a mug of beer wasn't just for celebration, it was the drink of everyday life. Children, workers, even monks sipped it daily. Not out of indulgence, but out of necessity. But why did entire communities prefer ale over the water flowing through their wells? And how did this simple drink shape work, wages, and even religion in the Middle Ages? Stay with me until the end, because tonight we'll quietly uncover the forgotten story of why medieval people lived in a world where beer was safer than water. And if you enjoy drifting through these sleepy journeys into the past, don't forget to subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep so you never miss another night of history. Chapter 1. The Perils of Medieval Water. When you picture life in the Middle Ages, it's easy to imagine castles looming over villages, bustling markets filled with traders and peasants working fields from sunrise to sunset. But if you were to step into that world and ask for a drink of plain, clean water, you would likely be met with raised eyebrows, suspicion, or even laughter. For much of medieval Europe, water was not considered the safest choice for quenching thirst. Beer or ale, as it was more commonly known, was the everyday beverage, consumed by men, women, and even children. To understand why this was the case, we must begin with the water itself. Today, you turn on a tap and expect clean, filtered, safe drinking water. In the Middle Ages, such a luxury did not exist. Water sources were open, unprotected, and frequently contaminated by both human and animal activity. Rivers and streams, the most common sources of water, were often shared by communities for every conceivable purpose: washing clothes, bathing, disposing of waste, watering animals, and sometimes even dumping refuse. The very same stream you might drink from could also be the place where a butcher rinsed animal remains, or where townspeople emptied their chamber pots. For medieval towns and villages, sanitation was not a system, but rather a patchwork of habits and customs. Latrines often drained into ditches or directly into rivers, meaning that fresh-looking water was anything but pure. Wells, too, could be risky. If dug too shallow or placed too near waste pits, wells could easily become contaminated. The technology to test for bacteria or invisible toxins did not exist, and people relied on appearance and taste. But as we know today, clear water is not always clean water. Outbreaks of dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and other waterborne diseases plagued medieval communities, even if they did not understand the exact causes. So, why turn to beer? The process of brewing ale involved boiling water as part of the mashing process. Grain was steeped in hot water, releasing sugars and flavors, and then fermented. This boiling step inadvertently killed off many of the harmful bacteria that made raw water unsafe. Although medieval brewers did not understand germ theory, they noticed that people who drank ale tended to fare better than those who drank directly from rivers or wells. Over time, ale became not just a beverage of choice, but a necessity for survival. It is also worth noting that medieval ale was not necessarily the strong, intoxicating drink we associate with beer today. Most of the ale consumed daily was what we would now call small beer, a weak brew with low alcohol content, often between 1% and 3%. It provided hydration, calories, and some measure of safety without leaving the drinker constantly drunk. Stronger ales and wines were reserved for special occasions, feasts, or wealthier households. Even children were given small beer as part of their meals. In fact, for many families, ale was an essential foodstuff rather than a luxury drink. It carried grains, nutrients, and calories that supplemented a diet often lacking in variety. Workers in the fields, artisans in workshops, and even monks in monasteries depended on it daily. Records show that laborers sometimes received part of their wages in ale rations, underlining just how central it was to medieval life. But while water carried risks, this does not mean it was entirely shunned. Medieval people still drank water, particularly in rural areas with access to cleaner springs or mountain streams. Monasteries, for example, often had carefully managed water supplies, using aqueducts or conduits to bring fresh water into cloisters. Some noble households built stone conduits to channel spring water directly into their kitchens or courtyards. These exceptions, however, were not the norm for ordinary villagers, who lacked both the resources and knowledge to safeguard water in this way. One must also remember that medieval drinking habits were shaped not just by health concerns, but also by cultural and religious practices. Brewing ale was a household task in many villages, often done by women known as alewives. Their small-scale production supplied families and neighbors with the daily drink. The sale of ale was regulated by local authorities, and ale tasters were appointed to ensure quality and measure pricing. This regulation, mundane as it may sound, demonstrates how deeply ale was embedded in local economies and social order. In monasteries, monks brewed on a larger scale, often perfecting recipes and producing enough to sustain their communities as well as sell to outsiders. The Benedictine rule even allowed for a daily ration of ale or wine for each monk, acknowledging its importance in diet and health. These monastic breweries became centers of innovation, gradually shaping brewing traditions that would survive into the modern era. Yet, despite all this, we must ask, was medieval ale truly safe? The answer is complicated. While the brewing process removed many of the dangers found in raw water, hygiene standards were still far from modern. Brewing vessels were not always clean, and storage methods could allow for spoilage. Contaminants were still possible, though less deadly than waterborne pathogens. In truth, ale was the safer gamble, not the perfect solution. Still, for the average medieval villager, ale was a constant companion. Whether at breakfast, lunch, or the evening meal, it was present on the table. Travelers carried flasks of ale for journeys, and markets sold it by the jug. Its ubiquity meant that medieval Europeans drank far more beer than most modern societies do today. Though again, the low alcohol levels meant intoxication was less of an issue than we might imagine. This reliance on ale over water shaped more than just diet. It influenced work, wages, trade, and even gender roles. As women's brewing sustained households and communities, it shaped laws, with fines imposed for selling poor quality ale. It shaped culture, with feasts overflowing with stronger brews and ordinary meals always accompanied by their weaker cousin. The question that lingers is this: was it simply practicality that kept medieval people drinking ale, or was there something deeper at play, something about trust, custom, and the rhythms of daily life that made beer more than just a safer drink? Chapter 2. The art and labor of brewing. When you picture a medieval village, it's easy to imagine peasants bent over their fields, blacksmiths hammering iron at their forges, or merchants shouting prices in a crowded marketplace. Yet behind the doors of small, smoky cottages, another form of labor was just as essential to daily survival: the brewing of ale. Unlike today, where beer is associated with large breweries, medieval brewing was often small-scale, domestic, and largely the responsibility of women. Brewing was not seen as a specialized craft in the early centuries of the Middle Ages, but rather as an extension of household work, alongside baking bread, spinning wool, or tending animals. The woman of the house, often referred to as the alewife, was expected to provide drink for her family, and sometimes, when production exceeded what they needed, to sell ale to neighbors. The process itself was time-consuming and required both skill and attentiveness. Barley, the most common grain used, had to be malted, a labor-intensive step that transformed raw grain into something suitable for brewing. To malt barley, alewives soaked the grain in water until it sprouted slightly, then dried it over a kiln or open fire. This drying process was delicate. Too much heat could ruin the malt, while too little would leave it damp and unusable. Once malted, The barley was ground into a coarse flour, mixed with hot water, and stirred in large tubs to release sugars in what was called the mash. The next stage was boiling. Though in the earliest medieval centuries, not all brews were boiled. Those that were benefited from the accidental sterilization we now recognize. After the mash was prepared, the liquid known as wort was drained and left to ferment. In many households, fermentation happened naturally, with yeast from the environment colonizing the wort. Later, brewers learned to save yeast from previous batches, gradually developing more reliable brewing practices. Flavor was another matter. Today we think of hops as central to beer, giving it bitterness and extending shelf life. But hops were not widely used in much of medieval Europe until later in the Middle Ages, around the 13th to 15th centuries, depending on the region. Before that, brewers flavored ale with a mixture called grüt, which might include herbs like yarrow, bog myrtle, rosemary, or even juniper. These additions gave ale a wide range of tastes and smells. Depending on local plants and traditions, ale was generally brewed in small batches because it spoiled quickly. Without hops, it could turn sour within a few days, meaning families brewed frequently, sometimes multiple times per week. This also made brewing an ongoing part of household rhythms, as essential as baking bread. For the alewife, this task demanded vigilance, preparing grains, managing fires, stirring mashes, monitoring fermentation, and ensuring containers were ready for storage. In towns and cities, the business of brewing took on greater scale. Here, brewing became more commercialized, with some women brewing so much that they effectively ran taverns or alehouses. The image of the alewife became both respected and mocked. On one hand, she was indispensable, providing a necessary drink. On the other, she was often satirized in literature and sermons, accused of diluting ale, overcharging, or gossiping too much with customers. The stereotypical alewife was sometimes depicted with a tall, pointed hat, a detail some historians believe may have contributed to later associations with witch imagery. Because ale was so central to diets, authorities closely regulated it. Towns appointed ale tasters or ale conners, officials tasked with inspecting brews to ensure quality and fairness in pricing. If an alewife sold weak or watered-down ale, she risked fines or public shame. Records from English towns in the 14th century show women repeatedly fined for selling short measure or bad ale. These fines, however, reveal more than fraud. They highlight the ubiquity of ale in everyday transactions and the importance placed on its integrity. Brewing also provided women with one of the few means of earning independent income. While much of the brewing was done to feed their own households, selling ale could bring in extra money, supplementing farming or craft work. For widows or unmarried women, brewing might even serve as a livelihood. Yet, by the late Middle Ages, as brewing scaled up into larger, more commercial operations, men increasingly entered the trade, gradually edging women out of dominance in the profession. Monastic breweries, for instance, operated on a much larger scale, producing ale not just for monks, but for sale to surrounding communities. Wealthy monasteries became brewing centers, combining access to resources with careful record keeping that preserved brewing knowledge over centuries. Monks were known for their discipline and precision, which translated into more consistent brewing practices. They experimented with ingredients, refined malting methods, and in some regions, introduced hops earlier than lay brewers. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed each monk a daily measure of ale or wine, underlining how vital it was to the monastic diet. Some abbeys, such as those in Germany and Flanders, became renowned for the quality of their beers, laying the foundations for traditions that still influence brewing today. The logistics of brewing also reveal much about medieval communities. Brewing required large amounts of fuel to heat water, which was a costly resource. It required clean containers, barrels, pitchers, and storage jugs, which were valuable items. It required time and attention, meaning households had to organize their labor carefully. Brewing, therefore, was never just a casual task. It was a significant investment of resources, woven into the very fabric of survival, and let us not forget, the economics of ale beyond the household. In many towns, taverns or inns relied on ale sales to stay afloat. Ale fueled not only bodies, but also commerce. Travelers needed drink, workers needed refreshment, and feasts required plenty of ale. For celebration, tax records show that ale sales were a major source of local revenue, with governments eager to profit from its ubiquity. This meant brewing was never entirely private. It was always subject to regulation, oversight, and often taxation. Yet for all the oversight and regulation, brewing was still a profoundly local, personal affair. Every village, and often every household, had its own way of brewing. Ingredients varied depending on what grew nearby, and flavors reflected local herbs and traditions. A traveler moving across Europe would encounter a vast diversity of ales, some strong and bitter, others sweet and mild, each tied to the environment and culture of its makers. The ale you drank was not just a beverage, it was a product of your household, your neighbors, or your local monastery. It carried with it the taste of your soil, the labor of your family, and the customs of your community. It was both sustenance and identity. But here lies an intriguing question. While ale was undeniably safer than most water and essential for survival, was its dominance in medieval diets purely about necessity? Or did brewing and drinking ale become so ingrained in daily routines that it turned into a cultural preference, something people trusted and valued beyond just practicality? Chapter 3. Ale and Society, Work, Wages, and Worship. By the time you've traced the grain through the malting, the brewing, and the pouring into clay mugs or wooden cups, it becomes clear that ale was more than just a drink in medieval life. It was a cultural anchor, woven into the rhythms of work, the obligations of wages, and even the sacredness of religion. To understand why medieval people preferred beer and ale over water, you need to see not only the practical necessity, but also the social meaning attached to it. Ale as part of wages for much of the medieval world. Wages were not only paid in coin. Laborers often received part of their compensation in food and drink, and ale was a regular feature of these payments. A day's work in the fields might earn you not just bread or porridge, but also a ration of ale. Records from English manors in the 13th and 14th centuries show that workers could expect to receive ale alongside their meals during harvest time. Ale provided both hydration and calories, keeping laborers fueled through long hours in the fields. For employers, supplying ale was a practical way of ensuring their workers remained capable of the physically demanding tasks that sustained agriculture. Ale also created bonds of obligation and loyalty. To refuse ale at a feast or gathering might be seen as an insult, just as failing to provide it could be viewed as neglect. Landlords and lords who offered generous amounts of ale were remembered favorably, while those who rationed it too harshly risked discontent among their tenants. In this sense, ale was as much about social expectation as it was about nourishment. Ale in everyday work. Ale was present in nearly every type of work. Sailors carried barrels of ale aboard ships sometimes, preferring it to the unpredictable supply of fresh water on long voyages. Builders and masons drank ale at construction sites, where it was safer than drawing water from wells near towns that were often contaminated by waste. Even clergy in monasteries drank ale daily, with some abbots carefully recording the number of pints distributed to monks during meals. The type of ale consumed often depended on the work being done. Stronger brews might be saved for festivals, while small ale or table ale, lower in alcohol, was reserved for everyday drinking, including by children. Small ale provided hydration without quickly leading to drunkenness, making it practical for daily use. It's worth remembering that alcohol content in medieval ale was generally lower than in many modern beers, though it varied. Because brewing lacked standardization, strength depended on ingredients, fermentation, and the skill of the brewer. But in most cases, medieval ale was consumed in large volumes without the same immediate intoxication you might expect today. Ale. And religion. Ale also had its place in the sacred world. Churches and monasteries brewed not just for themselves, but also for charity. Religious feasts, holy days, and community gatherings required ample supplies of drink, and ale was a symbol of hospitality. Monks, in particular, were renowned brewers. They approached brewing with a discipline that made their ale more consistent and often higher quality. For some monasteries, brewing became a source of income, funding charitable works and the upkeep of religious buildings. The connection between brewing and religion remains visible today in the traditions of monastic beers that continue in certain European abbeys. There was also a moral conversation around ale. Preachers warned against drunkenness, citing biblical admonitions, but they rarely condemned ale itself. Instead, they focused on moderation. In sermons and moral tales, the figure of the drunken villager or the dishonest alewife appeared as a cautionary example, a reminder that excess led to folly. But drinking ale in itself was not sinful. It was rather a natural and expected part of life. Ale and law. Given its importance, ale inevitably entered into law and regulation. Local governments kept strict watch over brewing and selling practices. Officials like ale tasters tested batches to ensure they met standards, and anyone caught selling short measures or weak ale risked fines. Taxes on ale were also a significant source of revenue for towns and monarchs. During wartime, for instance, ale and beer taxes were increased to fund armies and campaigns. This meant every pint poured into a cup carried with it a thread of connection to larger political and economic forces. In some towns, ordinances dictated when and how ale could be sold, often linked to market days and church festivals. Brewing was not just a domestic affair, but part of a regulated economy, monitored for fairness, safety, and profit. Festivals and celebrations. Perhaps most vivid, though, was ale's role in celebration. No feast was complete without it. Weddings, harvest festivals, saints' days, and even funerals required large quantities of ale. To run out of ale during a celebration was a mark of poor planning and could stain a family's reputation. In villages, communal brewing sometimes occurred ahead of big events, with households contributing to ensure there was enough to go around. The clinking of mugs, the toasts made, and the songs sung over ale became part of the fabric of memory. It was through such moments that communities bonded and traditions passed from one generation to the next. Ale was also central to what you might call the economy of generosity. To offer a cup of ale to a guest was a gesture of welcome, while to decline, it might be seen as a rejection of friendship. In this way, ale went beyond its practical uses, becoming a symbol of hospitality, trust, and inclusion. Water and the final question. So by now, you see why ale dominated so thoroughly. It wasn't just that water was unsafe, though in many urban environments, it certainly was. It wasn't just that ale provided calories, though that was essential in a world where physical labor was constant. And it wasn't just that brewing preserved grain in liquid form, though that was practical in terms of storage. It was that ale became part of the way people worked, ate, prayed, celebrated, and lived together. To prefer ale over water was not merely a choice, it was the natural outcome of a society built around its rhythms. And yet, one lingering question remains. As towns grew larger, as brewing methods improved, and as sources of water were managed more carefully, did medieval people ever stop to wonder whether their attachment to ale was entirely practical, or whether it had, by habit, become something deeper, a cultural preference that shaped their entire worldview? Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight. I hope this little journey into the slower corners of history helped you drift a bit closer to rest. If you'd like more calm stories like this, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. Your support helps keep these peaceful histories alive, and I'd love to share many more with you. Until next time, may your night be calm and your dreams be gentle.